Hello and welcome to Cracking Culture Change. My name's Andy and today's episode topic is how to have it all and avoid burnout. My guest today is Deborah Bulcock, business leader and coach that specialises in the field of enabling people to thrive at work. I was particularly keen to explore the subject of burnout with Deborah, how to spot it, how to manage it, and to understand its overall impact on people and organisations. I hope you enjoy this episode and I'll catch up with my reflections at the end. Hello and welcome to Series 2 of Cracking Culture Change, the podcast where you'll learn real life stories about how to crack your culture. I'm Andy Loveless and I'm joined today by Deborah Bulcock, who I will introduce in a couple of moments and she can say hello. Today's topic is how to have it all and avoid burnout. So it's very topical, I think, at the moment. And I'm going to be a great conversation with Deborah about this. So, Deborah, you're down here as a business change and operations director, leadership coach, mentor, nutritional therapist, author, impassioned champion of enabling people to thrive and perform at work, is what it said on the profile.
Yes,
so that sounds like you.
That I wear, yeah. Hi.
Okay, brilliant. I thought it would be good to just hear a bit about your story and that brought you to this point and specialising in this topic. So would you mind giving us the sort of background to how we got to be here?
Yeah, of course I will. I'll give you the nutshell version because this can be a long topic in itself. So my professional background is in banking. I've done 20 years in banking and largely at those senior levels in operations and in transformation as well. And, had a really great career, actually, with plenty of advancement and opportunity and development and meeting some great people. But ultimately, working in environments with really high pressure at a fast pace. And, during giving away my age, but kind of in the 90s and in the noughties when we didn't know the same kind of level of information we do about mental health and things then. And 10 years ago, it's actually 10 years ago this year, I experienced a level of ill health that nobody could explain. So I ended up kind of being out of work. I was just about bedridden for about 3 months. And no one had any answers for me. But what we know now and what I learned at the time through kind of trying to get myself well was that I was experiencing burnout. And I can talk to you more about what that felt like in a moment, if you like. And it made me really reevaluate my career, my profession, what I was doing, how I was spending my time, and set me off on a new journey. And over the last 10 years, whilst I've kept my hand in banking, it's been in a slightly different way, usually in a consultancy manner. But I've also became a nutritional therapist. I went back to school for 3 years and got those qualifications. The reason for that being that complementary health is what got me back to health.
Right.
So trained as a nutritional therapist and also got all of my accreditations as a leadership coach. And that's what brings me to where I am today. In essence, in that I do wear a number of hats, but my focus is always how can people be their absolute best at work, and in brackets, and have enough left in the tank to live life fully.
Yeah.
Really important bit.
Lovely. Okay. So let's get into what we mean by burnout, because it's sort of bandied around, isn't it, as a term? What are the sort of definitions of burnout, if that's the right way of getting into it?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because like you've commented, it's a really commonly used term these days. So if someone is feeling tired, they might often use the term, now I'm feeling burnt out. And that's helpful, both unhelpful and helpful, because we're raising awareness of something, but we're misusing the term. So burnout isn't actually a medical condition. So people think it is, but it still hasn't made its way into, certainly in the UK, to being a medical condition that a doctor would diagnose, for example. So they might talk about it, but it's not something they can give you medication for or what have you. Back in 2019, the World Health Organization did give it a definition in their classification of diseases. They talk about it being a workplace syndrome that's represented by a number of things, including, less motivation, less effectiveness at work, a level of cynicism that might be creeping in. So they have a definition which you can easily find. I think there's something in the middle ground. So I think the World Health Organization definition is woefully short and places it very much as a workplace problem. Whereas I see burnout as so this is a personal view from working in this space for years now. I see it as a whole person condition. I think when you're experiencing burnout, you will have some common symptoms like an extreme level of fatigue. You will have things like brain fog, really cognitive dysfunction, if you will, not being able to concentrate like you would have been previously. There will be a level of detachment because people don't really know what's going on for you. But there will be differences for everybody as well. And for me, there's a combination of things. There's something about how we look after ourselves. And, if we look at my instance of burnout, I was a push it hard person all of the time. So I was always pushing it at work. I was always pushing it in my personal life. And I didn't have any form of self-care or recuperation mechanisms in place. And then there's an environmental factor. And I was working in an environment that didn't really align with my values for an extended period of time. And that had an impact as well. So there's two sides to this. And quite often when somebody is experiencing burnout, we shine the spotlight on the person and say, what do you need to do? And whilst that's important, we also have to shine the spotlight, for example, on the workplace and say, what is it about that workplace that can be driving that too?
And is this, as you were talking about this, the well-being and self-care has, I think, come up much more as a result of COVID, hasn't it? The whole conversation about looking after yourself and looking after others seems to have become, my perception anyway, much higher up the agenda. But how does that play into burnout? Is it got better or worse as a result of COVID and the whole lockdown thing, or what's your take?
So if we look at some of the surveys that are about, I was going to say research, but it's not really research. We've got lots of surveys and polls that take place more regularly now on the subject of burnout. And all of that is showing us that burnout levels are on the increase, that COVID had a significant impact on that. But I know we're not truly post-pandemic yet, but given where we are at this point in time in 2022, levels are still on the rise from a burnout point of view. And there's different schools of thought about what's causing that, whether that's hybrid working having an impact, whether it's simply increased awareness and therefore more self-reporting of burnout. And I don't think there's really a true answer on that. So different surveys and polls will tell you slightly different things.
So we haven't got a reliable set of data, as it were, that we can say it's gone from here to here. It's the general sense is it's got worse as a result of COVID and lockdown.
Yeah. So if you look at some of the bigger studies, which have tens or hundreds of thousands of people in the studies, tend to be US based. Now we can usually extrapolate, that information for ourselves. The UK based surveys are more a couple of thousand people, like point in time.
Yeah.
All that might have been done. But irrespective, they are all showing an increase in the level of burnout. They're all showing that there's a gender mix here, that women are reporting burnout at a higher incidence than men. And I guess the key point is that they're reporting it. So
Why do you think
doesn't mean
women are higher than men on this at the moment?
so. There's a really good study by McKinsey and Co. actually, which looked at women in the workplace, and there's a specific section on there now on burnout. And what they cite, and I can understand this from the conversations I have, is that the COVID period, so the pandemic period, on the whole, put a greater pressure on women to juggle than it did for men to juggle. So in terms of a lot of the childcare burden, when children couldn't go to school, fell more predominantly to women than it did to men. And I know you're always very careful about stereotyping, aren't you? But this is what's coming up in the report still, is that we've still got this instance where men in the family tend to be in more senior jobs in a lot of, in a more, on average, that's happening more still. And therefore that career was prioritised during the COVID period.
Yeah.
So this is just some of those dynamics that we understand and that we've been dealing with for years in lots of ways. But those things have therefore had an influence on what's happened for women during that period. So when you look at the McKinsey report, burnout rates for both men and women have gone up post-pandemic, but they've gone up at a higher rate for women than they have for men.
Okay.
So it's not just a female issue; it is an everybody issue.
Yes.
But one of the consistent trends that I see, whether it's a really small poll versus a really big study, is that there is a gender difference. Definitely a working age difference. So if you look at retirement age versus working age, the working age is a higher incidence of burnout.
Yeah.
And then there are some studies, so some Gallup information shows that people who have a managerial responsibility, and by that I mean a line management responsibility, tend to have a greater incidence than those who don't have people management responsibility as well. But I've only seen that in one place, in a Gallup survey.
Okay. And can we explore the sort of continuum, I suppose, from a fully well-functioning, happy, healthy person to a burnt-out person? What is the journey, and what is how people talk about some healthy stress? A little bit of stress is good, I've heard. And
yes.
When does stress become? When does it start to go into the red zone, and what are the signals and the messages and the signs that? Because I imagine there's a lot of people listening to this who might be somewhere down that track without even knowing, as it were. So anything like that we can do would be helpful, I think.
Yeah. And you know what? It's one of the key questions I get asked all of the time is, how do I know if I'm burning out?
Yeah.
The journey is different for everybody, but what's consistent is that people don't burn out overnight. People get to burnout over a long period of time. So I believe my own journey to burnout was about 10 years. So with the benefit of hindsight, and you start looking back and say, yes, I stopped doing that at that point in time, or I stopped participating in that hobby because I no longer had the energy, or this changed for me.
So you're sort of shutting down potential sources of well-being, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my first message is whilst you can feel like you've fallen off the cliff overnight. So when it happened to me, and when I mean the point of debilitation. So the point at which I became bedridden did happen overnight. It was like my body just decided that was the point at which it was shutting down. It had had enough. But the journey to that is a really long time. And there are a whole range of different signs that people can watch out for. And it does become difficult because there's overlap with other conditions as well.
Yes.
But the main one is obviously fatigue. So if there's a persistent level of fatigue that cannot be recovered by a weekend of rest, by a holiday, what have you, and that is gradually getting worse, I'd say that's your main sign. Your main sign that something has to change. Otherwise, you're going to and people can continue operating and actually performing well while they're tired. We've probably all done that. But when it carries on for a significant period of time, there's a knock-on physiological effect in many parts of your system that become very hard to recover from without some specific intervention and time to do that. So I think fatigue is the main thing, and knowing that things happen over a period of time. That doesn't mean that if you're feeling fatigued, you've got burnout. So it's about getting this in context. So we can go through very busy periods, can't we? We might have a 3 or 4 month period where things are tough for a whole number of reasons, work and personally, and we feel exhausted. But if there's a point at which we can recover from that and we're able to recover, then that's okay. That's the peaks and troughs of life. It's the point at which nothing you do enables you to recover from your sense of fatigue. So that's the main one. There'll be other things like, something that people commonly mention is the fact that they're struggling. The memory's gone, they're struggling to concentrate in the same way. Decision making is harder, problem solving is more difficult, and the confidence might start reducing as a result of those things at work. For other people, because we're talking about stress really and the management of stress, it can pop up in other ways. So some of my clients, for example, might say I'm absolutely exhausted, but they've also got a really serious like digestive condition. So they might have developed irritable bowel syndrome. Now, there can be a whole host of reasons for irritable bowel syndrome, but it can be triggered by stress and it can be exacerbated by stress. So there's just a myriad of symptoms that can arise, but I'd say the main thing to look out for is fatigue. But if you've got unexplained health conditions going on, then do have a look at your stress levels and work out whether that's exacerbating things. Does that make sense, Andy?
Yeah, it does make sense. I'm starting to get worried now because I've noticed my memory is not quite as good as it used to be. Am I burnt out? But I guess it's tricky, isn't it? Because some of these things, if you think about them, it's well, could that be aging? I'm just getting older, and I suppose one of the difficulties is sifting through it all and not just justifying everything by, well, that's because of getting older or something. It might actually be something different that does need more attention, or something you can do something about. Let's say you can't do anything about getting older, as far as I know.
Sure, absolutely, and I think this is why I speak with a level of caution on this. And when I write about this stuff, I write with a level of caution of that you having any of these symptoms I'm talking about is not a diagnosis of burnout, because some people can talk about, fatigue and having low mood and a level of disconnection with burnout, but they're also symptoms of depression, for example. So if things aren't right, the first port of call is always a medical professional, and get things ruled out or ruled in and look at those. But quite often, if you're not getting easy answers out of our, wonderful NHS, but that more traditional medical system, then sometimes we do have to turn to other, I guess, different tests that we can do in private practice and things like that help us understand what's going on in the body in a bit more detail. So always rule out the obvious. Is the main thing.
Go to your GP is the message I'm hearing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that will rule in or rule out certain things, and then you can move on from. Yeah. Okay, that's good. Is there any research or any insight you can give on the impact of this stuff, stress and burnout, on, say, an organisation? I don't know if there's like a health check or anything like that. But I imagine if you've got a lot of people who are in sort of various stages of stress and or burnout, it must have a big impact on productivity and morale and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So there isn't I haven't yet, I'm not saying there isn't, I haven't yet found research or a study that says burnout specifically costs business this, but there are proxies. So like the Health and Safety Executive in Great Britain does an annual report on stress, depression and anxiety. So that's quite a big bucket.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And they look at the cost of that to business. So it's obviously a much broader category that we're talking about from a mental health point of view. But the equivalent, let me just get these numbers right. It's a 4-figure number. So the cost of workplace absence associated with stress, depression and anxiety is over £1,000 per employee. So not per employee of the ones that are absent, per employee.
Total so if you, employees.
Yes. So if you look at that
That's
across
a big
business,
number.
And I believe that will be underreported because things like stress, anxiety and depression often still aren't what people put on their medical notes for work for reasons we understand. They're worried about implications of that. But yeah, the closest I've found, certainly for UK information, is that Health and Safety Executive report, which is a Great Britain study as opposed to UK that they do. So it's worthwhile looking at that each year.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. When you mentioned there, you said people might be reluctant to put that on their form for fear of something. What can you tell us a bit more about that? What is that? Is that there's like a stigma if I put down that I'm stressed or something? It's a bad thing,
absolutely.
or
So I'm talking more anecdotally here. So I have a lot of clients who are either in burnout or approaching burnout. They're in senior roles in organisations. They are not willing to put on firstly, they're not willing to even go off sick. So presenteeism is definitely higher because people are going to work unwell. But when they do go off sick, and I did this, I didn't put stress on my form, I had virus on my form. I had a conversation with my doctor about what would be put on my absence note when I was off, and there was no way in the world I was having stress put on there. And that's the same for lots of people. And I think it's definitely changing with depression and anxiety because of all the great work that's happened in the mental health space over recent years. But strangely, that same thing doesn't really apply to stress and burnout. Certainly not in, I guess, so I'm in my 40s, like my generation and older. I think in like people in their 20s, they're more open to talking about this and putting a label to things, which is more helpful. But I think we've still got a massive chunk of the workforce which are not willing to use the stress word or the burnout word.
Why is that these days?
Well, I can only speak from what I've heard from people, and it is about stigma. So it is about, if I use the stress word, there's an unwritten thing in there that I can't cope with my job. And if I can't cope with my job, then does that mean that my job is secure? Does that mean that because I'm having a bad period now, I'll never get the opportunity for promotion or other roles? So it is stigma ultimately. That's what it's coming back to.
Yeah,
which
kind of exacerbates the potential problem, doesn't it?
Of course,
there's more pressure on to not disclose and keep it to yourself and keep going and be brave and be strong, and I guess all of which makes it worse.
Yeah, and it will make it worse. But you mentioned it earlier. I didn't respond to it then, but there is this balance between what we consider healthy levels of stress. So we all need some level of stress to enable us to perform. So good stress versus distress, if you will. But everyone's point of being in the zone from a stress point of view when stress is good will be different. It's not the same for everybody. And therefore increasing our awareness of, do you know what, this is the kind of stress that allows me to perform, that I can really easily recover from, that, makes me motivated and happy in what I'm doing. That's what we sort of need to understand for ourselves, and then we
Sort of finding
manage.
your own sweet spot,
Yes.
finding your own zone that's a real art, isn't it? To know, and then once you find it, stay in it and don't get out of whack, don't get out of balance.
Yeah. And the thing is, it will always move up and down. We'll never,
Yeah.
you don't have, I don't know, Usain Bolt, running the fastest 100 meters every 100 meters he runs, or all of the time. But I think more often than not, if we know what can cause us distress and we can actively manage those things, we probably won't be able to avoid them. But if we can actively manage them and know what we need to be able to recover from those stressors, then that becomes really helpful self-insight, and things that we can do something positive with.
And just talking about self-insight and positivity in your book, one of the things I loved was you talking about finding your moments of joy, I think it was.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a bit about that and how that plays a part in this whole picture? What do you mean by that?
So that book that I wrote 3 years ago now, Have It All Without Burning Out, is very much a self-help book. So it's more about looking at yourself and saying, what is stress for me? What are my stressors? How do I manage things? How do I create resilience building, resilience promoting habits for myself? That's the crux of the entire book. But I have a section in there which is about moments of joy, because I have this real belief that in the constant quest for happiness, we're always disappointed. Because if someone says to you, "Are you happy right now, Andy?" your answer will probably be like, "Yeah, most of the time." It's hardly ever an absolute firm yes. Whereas really our general happiness, if you will, is built up of many, many moments of joy. And that moment of joy might be, the colour of the sky today, or the taste of a cup of tea, or watching your child do something, or something happening at work. It can come from all manner of things. And when you start saying, "Have you had any moments of joy today?" the answer is typically yes. There's at least one that I can talk about, because they're often the small things. And as soon as, what I find with people is that when they start focusing on what brings me joy, both professionally and personally, and focusing on getting more of those, it automatically kind of increases the happiness scale. So I tend to try and focus with people on what's really achievable and manageable, and that's usually small things.
Yeah, it's a great question. What moments of joy have you had today? And as I'm sensing as you're talking, I'm thinking about myself, and I would say, yes, I have. And as soon as you go there, you start to talk about them, your energy goes up a bit. And I guess the trick to it is good. Do more of those, have more of those, and then you build up a whole new level of happiness, I suppose.
Yeah. And for me, it was, sorry, Andy. I was just going to say it was very much in the context of, I deliberately titled that book "Have It All Without Burning Out," because the moments of joy piece is in the context of what is your all. Because quite often we're striving for something that isn't actually going to bring us joy. So we might be striving for a career that we've fallen into and never really thought about. Or we might be striving for a level of income that actually costs us more than it gains us. Or, there's all of these things. So we say, when you're having it all without burning out, like, what is your all? And to really explore that, you're exploring what brings you joy. Like, what does bring you joy every day, and how do you get more of that?
Great.
So
we're almost out of time, but before we go, I know it's flown by. Before we go, do you have one tip or top tips you would share here now for having it all and avoiding burnout? I know it's a big old question. Where do you start? But are there things that you'd say always prioritize this and that?
I'd say, probably continuing from what we've just said, know what you really, really want. Like, know what brings you happiness, know what brings you joy, because you'd be surprised how many of us don't know that. So first things, like, know that, because it helps you to prioritize in your very, very busy schedules what you need to be spending your time doing or on or working towards. So I'd always say that. I would also say, like, be able to tune in with yourself. So actually know how you're feeling, what's going on for you physiologically and emotionally. Because if you've got the ability to tap into that, you've got the ability to do something about it. But when we're striving for something, we don't know if it's right for us, and we're numb to how we're feeling, that in itself is a problem. And then outside of that, I know this sounds really broad, but from a resilience building point of view, I'd kind of say just really focus on what is nourishing to you. So whether that's being down the pub with your friends versus being out on your own on a walk or what have you, what actually really allows you to recuperate and recharge. And don't do what someone else says you should do. Do what you know helps you to have that, to kind of finish doing something and go, I feel like I'm energized and, I've got mental clarity back and I'm ready for what's ahead. And that is different for everybody. So have that courage to go, this is what I should be doing, not having some guru tell me that this is what I should be doing. That's kind of, so make it personal.
Great advice. Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah, and been a real pleasure to talk this through with you today. Many thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I found that a really interesting conversation with Deborah about burnout and stress, and what a big problem it is, and probably an underreported problem it is, and the stigma that people have, almost, for the more senior you get, the more of a stigma it is to report these things because of the fear that comes with that. So I thought that was very interesting. I loved her advice around understanding what your all is in terms of having it all. What is your all? And is that really your all, or is that someone else's all that you think you should be pursuing? So I think that's great. She talked a lot about raising self-awareness of the signs of burnout and signs of stress way before that might lead to burnout eventually, so being more aware. And then I loved her thing around moments of joy versus pursuit of happiness. And if you can identify your moments of joy, they're things you can do something about, and you can generally do more to have more moments of joy. I think it's really good advice, wise advice. If you'd like help to crack your culture, please get in touch with us at www.pecanpartnership.co.uk. And don't forget to subscribe to the series and share this episode with anyone you think might find it interesting or useful. Thank you.